Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I hope you're all having a wonderful and warm day today. Today we continue the deeply emotional story of CEO Quân and Tiểu. After leaving the hospital, Tiểu is suddenly forced to make an heartbreaking decision. Stay with the man she loves or walk away forever to save him from losing everything. His company, his wealth, and his entire future. What will she choose? Stick around to find out. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next part. A few days had passed since Tiểu was discharged from the hospital. The sterile smell of antiseptic and the constant beeping of machines were finally behind them. She looked so much better, with a bit of color returning to her cheeks and a gentle smile that would occasionally break through whenever Quân was around. He had been her rock, ditching meetings, ignoring calls, and focusing entirely on helping her settle back into normal life. That afternoon, as they walked out of the hospital together, Quân carried her small bag in one hand and gently held her arm with the other, guiding her under the soft golden sunlight filtering through the trees. "We're finally going home," he said softly, his voice warm and reassuring. "You can rest properly now, and I'll make sure everything is taken care of." For a brief moment, it felt like the storm had passed. They returned to the quiet apartment Quân had arranged for her, a cozy space filled with little touches he knew she would like. He even cooked a simple meal that evening. Nothing fancy, just warm porridge like the ones he prepared in the hospital kitchen, blowing on each spoonful carefully before offering it to her. They talked about small things, memories from better days, and for the first time in weeks, there was a fragile sense of hope hanging in the air. Quân promised he would stay close, that no matter what, he wasn't going anywhere. But peace like that never seems to last long in their world. The very next day, while Quân was forced to step back into the office to handle some urgent company matters he couldn't ignore any longer, Tiểu received a message. It was from Quan's father. The tone was formal and direct. He wanted to meet her alone at a small, quiet cafe on the outskirts of the city. No explanation, no details, just a time and a place. Her heart sank immediately. She knew this wasn't going to be a friendly conversation. Still, she went. She owed it to herself, and maybe even to Quân, to face whatever was coming. The cafe was peaceful, tucked away with views of a calm lake and gentle afternoon light dancing across the water. Quân was already there when she arrived, sitting straight-backed in his impeccably tailored clothes, looking every bit the powerful man who had built an empire. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. As soon as she sat down, he looked her straight in the eyes and spoke in a low, steady voice that carried the weight of years of authority. "Tiểu, I'm going to be direct with you. You've been with my son long enough now. I won't deny that Quân cares for you deeply. I've seen how he stayed by your side in that hospital, how he put everything else aside. But you need to understand the reality of the situation. If you truly love him, you have to let him go. Walk away now before it's too late." Tiểu felt her chest tighten. She sat there silently, her hands gripping the edge of the wooden table so tightly her knuckles turned white. The words hit her like a wave, but what came next was even heavier. "If you refuse to leave," his father continued, his voice growing firmer, "I will have no choice but to cut him off completely. The company, the assets, his position, everything he's worked for over the past decade and more. I'll make sure he loses it all. He will be left with nothing. Do you really want to watch Quân lose his entire future? Everything he's built with his own hands just because of this relationship?" The air around them seemed to grow thick and heavy. Tiểu could barely breathe. Flashes of memories flooded her mind all at once. She remembered Quân kneeling beside her hospital bed, his strong hands trembling as he fed her spoonful by spoonful. She remembered the quiet nights when he held her hand through the pain, telling her stories from their past just to make her smile. She remembered the way he pulled her into his arms after facing his father, whispering that he chose her, no matter what. Those moments weren't grand gestures. They were small, quiet acts of love that had kept her going when everything else felt like it was falling apart. And now, because of her, he might lose everything. She sat there, tears silently streaming down her face, unable to speak at first. The weight of his words pressed down on her like an invisible mountain. How could she be the reason Quan lost his life's work? How could she live with herself knowing she had dragged him away from his family, his empire, his future? Yet at the same time, the thought of walking away from him felt like tearing her own heart out. She loved him so much it hurt. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was his entire world. She loved his quiet strength, his patience, the way he made her feel safe even when the world was against them. After what felt like an eternity, she finally managed to whisper, her voice breaking, "Sir, can you give me a few days to think about this?" Quan's father didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her for a long moment, his expression a mix of sternness and something almost like reluctant understanding. Then he stood up, nodded once, and left without another word. The sound of his footsteps fading away left her sitting there alone, the weight of the decision crushing down on her shoulders. That night back in the apartment, Tu couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in the dark, clutching Quan's jacket that still carried his familiar scent. She buried her face in the fabric and cried until there were no tears left. The pain wasn't loud or dramatic. It was deep, silent, and all-consuming. On one side was the love she felt for Quan, the kind of love that made her want to fight for every moment together. On the other side was the reality of what staying would cost him. Could she really be that selfish? Could she watch the man who had given up so much for her lose everything else because of her? She replayed every tender moment in her mind, the way he cared for her without expecting anything in return, the way he chose her even when it meant standing against his own father. And now she was the one who had to make the impossible choice, keep holding on to their love or let go so that he could keep the life he had worked so hard to build. The next morning, her phone rang. Quan's name lit up the screen. She stared at it, her finger hovering over the answer button, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what she would say when she heard his voice. Would she tell him the truth? Would she pretend everything was okay? Or had the time come to make the hardest decision of her life? As the phone continued ringing persistently, Tu stood frozen in the middle of the quiet apartment, staring at Quan's name flashing brightly on the screen. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, making it difficult to breathe. She wanted to ignore the call, to disappear into the shadows and pretend none of this was happening. But deep down, she knew she couldn't hide forever. With trembling fingers, she finally swiped to answer. "On." Her voice cracked immediately, coming out so small and fragile that it didn't even sound like her anymore. On the other end, Quan's warm, familiar voice flooded through the speaker, full of genuine worry and care. He asked how she was feeling after leaving the hospital, whether her body was still in pain, if she had eaten properly, and if she needed him to drop everything at work to come see her right away. Each loving question felt like a dagger twisting deeper into her chest. She desperately wanted to break down right then and tell him the whole painful truth about the secret meeting with his father, the devastating ultimatum, the impossible choice now crushing her soul. But the words refused to leave her mouth. She forced a weak smile, even though he couldn't see it, and mumbled something about just feeling a little tired and needing some rest. When she finally hung up, the silence that followed was deafening. The phone slipped from her hand onto the couch as she slowly slid down the wall, collapsing onto the cold floor. She pulled her knees tightly to her chest and let the silent tears flow freely, her body shaking with the weight of everything she was holding inside. The next few days became an absolute emotional nightmare that Tu had never imagined. She barely touched any food, pushing away even the simplest meals she tried to make for herself. Sleep was almost non-existent, Every time she closed her eyes, the memories from the hospital came rushing back like powerful waves, overwhelming her completely. She could picture Quan so vividly. The once powerful and commanding CEO, now kneeling humbly beside her narrow hospital bed, his expensive shirt wrinkled and his usually perfect hair messy from exhaustion. She remembered how his strong hands would tremble slightly with emotion as he carefully prepared warm porridge in the small hospital kitchen, blowing gently on each spoonful to make sure it wasn't too hot before feeding her with infinite patience and love. Those quiet moments in the middle of the night when her fever spiked and her body was racked with pain. He was always there, wiping the cold sweat from her forehead and neck with a soft, clean cloth. His touch so incredibly tender that it made the cold, sterile hospital room feel a little warmer. She remembered his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet space as he told her old stories and funny anecdotes from their early days together, just to distract her from the physical suffering and the beeping machines around them. Those weren't the actions of someone who loved casually. Those were the sacrifices of a man who had put her above everything else in his life. His company, his meetings, his reputation. And now, because of her, he might lose it all. She spent endless hours sitting alone by the large window in the apartment, staring blankly at the city outside while clutching Quan's jacket that he had forgotten there one night. She buried her face deep into the fabric over and over, breathing in his familiar scent as tears continued to fall silently down her cheeks. "If I stay with him," she whispered brokenly to the empty room, her voice hoarse from crying, "his father will really follow through with the threat. Quan will lose the company he spent over 10 years building with blood, sweat, and countless sleepless nights. He'll lose his position, his financial security, his reputation in the business world, and the entire legacy his family has worked so hard to create. How can I live with that kind of guilt for the rest of my life? How can I be so selfish?" The thought made her physically sick, her stomach twisting into painful knots. But the alternative, forcing herself to walk away from the only man who had ever truly seen her, protected her, and made her feel deeply loved, felt like someone was ripping her soul apart piece by piece. The internal battle was so intense and exhausting that there were moments she had to clutch her chest tightly just to remind herself to keep breathing through the suffocating pain. She replayed the conversation with Quan's father in her mind hundreds of times. The way the older man had looked at her with that mix of stern authority and reluctant understanding. The calm but devastating way he delivered the ultimatum, making it crystal clear that if she didn't leave, Quan would be left with absolutely nothing. She understood his perspective on some level. He had built that empire for his son, planned his future with careful precision, but understanding didn't ease the unbearable weight on her heart. Tu Lac felt completely trapped between two devastating choices: holding on to the love that had given her strength during her darkest days, or letting go to protect the man she loved from total ruin. One particularly stormy afternoon, when the sky had turned dark gray and heavy rain was pounding relentlessly against the windows, Tu Lac could no longer keep avoiding the situation. Quan had grown extremely worried from her short, distant replies and sudden emotional withdrawal. He showed up at the apartment unannounced, his face etched with deep exhaustion and concern the moment he stepped through the door. The second he saw her pale face, swollen red eyes, and the way she was hugging herself, he didn't hesitate for even a second. Without saying a word, he crossed the room and pulled her gently but firmly into his strong, warm arms, holding her close against his chest exactly like he had done through so many difficult nights in the hospital. One hand slowly stroked her hair with infinite tenderness, while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back, trying to calm the constant trembling in her body. Please, I need you to tell me what's been troubling you these past few days," he whispered softly against her hair, his voice full of love, worry, and quiet determination. "You've been pulling away from me, and it's breaking my heart. Whatever it is, no matter how big or difficult, we can face it together. I'm right here with you. I won't go anywhere. Tu stayed buried in his warm embrace for a long, precious moment, savoring the sense of safety and love she had come to depend on so much. But the truth could no longer stay hidden. With a trembling voice that kept breaking, she slowly pulled back just enough to look at him and told him everything in painful detail. She described the unexpected meeting with his father at the quiet cafe by the lake, the serious and heavy atmosphere, and every single word the older man had spoken. She repeated the brutal ultimatum clearly. If she didn't leave Quan immediately, his father would cut him off completely. No company shares, no assets, no financial support, no position in the family business. Quan would be left entirely on his own, stripped of everything he had worked so hard to achieve. As she spoke, Quan's body tensed noticeably against hers. His arms tightened protectively around her waist, and she could clearly feel his heart racing. When she finally finished, a heavy, suffocating silence filled the entire apartment. Quan gently cupped her face with both of his hands, using his thumbs to carefully wipe away the fresh tears that kept rolling down her cheeks. His eyes burned with a powerful mixture of deep pain, restrained anger toward his father, and an unbreakable determination that made her heart ache even more. I already made my choice very clear to my father, he said, his voice low but incredibly firm and steady. I choose you, Tu. I don't care about the company. I don't care about the money, the power, or the family legacy. None of it means anything to me if I don't have you by my side. You are my everything now. Tu shook her head slowly, more tears spilling down uncontrollably as her emotions overwhelmed her. But Anna, I care so much about you. I can't be the selfish one who destroys your entire life. How can I live with myself knowing that because of me, you lost everything you've sacrificed years of your life for? Your dreams, your hard work, your future. I love you too much to let that happen to you. The tension in the small apartment became almost unbearable. Outside, the rain poured down even harder, beating violently against the windows as if mirroring the emotional storm raging between them. Quan tried to pull her back into his arms, whispering more words of reassurance and love. But Tu took a small, painful step backward. Her hands were trembling violently as she looked at the man she loved more than life itself, her heart shattering with every passing second. What if we can't overcome this? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the heavy rain. What if staying together means I have to watch you lose your whole world, all because of me? In that heartbreaking, frozen moment, with the storm raging violently outside and the weight of an impossible, life-changing decision hanging heavily in the air between them, Tu felt more lost, torn and devastated than she had ever felt in her entire life. Quan reached out for her hand once more, his eyes pleading with her not to pull away. But she hesitated, completely caught in the agonizing space between overwhelming love and the devastating fear of ruining his future forever. What will Tu ultimately decide? Will she find the courage to stay and fight for their love against all odds? Or will she make the ultimate, soul-crushing sacrifice and walk away to protect the man who gave up everything for her? The answer's coming soon in the next part, and it's going to be one of the most emotional and intense moments in their entire story. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss what happens next. After being discharged from the hospital, Tu finally begins to recover, only to face the most painful challenge yet. Quan's father secretly meets her and delivers a devastating ultimatum. She must leave his son immediately, or he will cut Quan off completely, stripping him of his company, wealth, position, and entire future, leaving him with nothing. Torn between her deep love for Quan and her fear of destroying his life, Tu falls into intense emotional turmoil. She spends days haunted by memories of Kwan's selfless care during her hospital stay, feeding her, staying by her side through painful nights, and choosing her over everything. When she finally reveals the truth to Kwan, he reaffirms his love without hesitation. However, as the rain pours outside, Tu Lac stands at a heartbreaking crossroads. Stay with the man she loves or sacrifice their relationship to protect his future? The impossible decision hangs heavily in the air, leaving their fate uncertain.